Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first day of the 2020 International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade. I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, and I want to say thank you so much for coming out and supporting the conference, and I really hope you get to enjoy all the presentations in this three-day event. What's incredible about attending these conferences is that you didn't have to pay for air travel or hotel rooms. You got to stay in the comfort and safety of your own homes if you wanted to, just to attend this. And in fact, we're being joined by students and scholars and researchers from all over the world. All 7 continents will be represented at this three-day event. So thank you for coming out. And with that said, I have the distinct pleasure of being able to introduce our first video presentation by somebody who really doesn't need any introduction, Dr. Robert M. Price, who will be discussing today the value of studying theology for atheists. Now, a little bit about Dr. Price is that he's actually a former Baptist fundamentalist. He's a former leader in the Montclair State College chapter of the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and a graduate of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he studied New Testament. He's also a former pastor of First Baptist Church of Montclair in New Jersey. He has a double PhD from Drew University in both systematic theology and the New Testament. He is now professor of biblical criticism at the Center for Inquiry Institute, and he's the editor of the Journal of Higher Criticism. I'd like to highlight 2 of his more recent book publications. This first one here is called Deconstructing Jesus. And in this, Dr. Price argues that liberal Protestant scholars have often created an historical Jesus that is more or less created in their own image. And he says that this is possible because, well, the Jesus of the Gospels is in fact a fictional mixture of several first-century prophets and messiahs, and that he is purely a mythic mystery cult redeemer and a Gnostic ion. As a result, the historical Jesus never actually existed in the first place. There was no historical figure Jesus, but instead multiple Christ cults that developed in the 1st and 2nd century. The next book that I want to talk about is called The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. And in this book, what Dr. Price does is he introduces readers to the methodology that was used in what's called the Jesus Seminar. Now, Dr. Price was an active member of the Jesus Seminar, which was a group of over 100 scholars from around the world as they went through the Gospels to see what was historically accurate about Jesus of Nazareth and what wasn't. And in fact, they ended up concluding that only about 18% of the 4 Gospels had any historical truth to it. So what this book does is it shows and walks through exactly how you determine what was historically authentic and what's not about historical Jesus research. And if you have a chance to ever take a look at these books, I highly recommend them. They are fantastic, a great read. Now, Dr. Price wasn't able to be here in person live for us for the presentation, so what he did was he created a 41-minute video specifically for this conference that he's asked us to play for him. There won't be any Q&A section afterwards, but there will be a Q&A session after the other presentations on this 3-day conference. And without further ado, here's Dr. Price.
Robert M. Price here. I ordinarily like to just sort of wing it in talks I give, but in this case, I'm actually going to read a prepared text, and the reason for that is pretty simple. As my old pastor, Don Mars, used to say, I'm going to quote myself so as not to misrepresent my own views. So with that, here we go with the value of theology for atheists. Is there such a thing as the supernatural? I don't mean to ask whether there is a being called God or if there are miracles. Even if God, miracles, and answered prayer are real, are they supernatural? What do we mean by that term? Some people believe that the striking events recorded in Scripture did actually happen, but that they were misdescribed by the clueless ancients as if they were supernatural, things that could never happen without divine magic. Such rationalists, with a capital R, have sought to re-explain these events in scientific terms unavailable to the ancients. A modern example would be members of UFO sects who believe, for instance, that Jesus' miraculous conception was an artificial insemination engendered by space aliens. There would have been nothing miraculous about it. Extraordinary, yes, but the aliens are envisioned as flesh and blood individuals in possession of advanced technology. The scenario would be much like that hilarious scene in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, when the time-traveling Dr. McCoy rescues Chekhov from the barbaric ministrations of late 20th century medicine. McCoy's techniques were perfectly ordinary and mundane in his own eyes, but seemed miraculous to patients in the hospital whom he helped along the way. I love that line. We're dealing with medievalism, Jim. That's the way it is with the flying saucer Jesus. Pretty amazing, but not beyond the limits of what is possible in nature. We might not understand the science yet, but in principle we could one day. But this is not quite what I have in mind. I'm thinking of two ancient philosophers. I fear we have not caught up with them. Thales of ancient Ionia probably qualifies as both the first scientist and the first philosopher. He invented science when he asked how the rain comes to fall. Religion, or myth, says rain is what happens when Zeus says, "Forsooth, let's have some rain here, chop chop." Science, by contrast, tells us, or hopes to tell us, how it rains. Even if we still want to say it's the work of Father Zeus, there must be some way, some method by which he does it, right? If his spoken word does the trick, how? Mustn't we picture some chain of cause and effect? If we picture Circe casting a spell, mustn't there be some way in which the spoken formula brings about the desired outcome? Doesn't there have to be, say, some kind of property in the magic words? The syllables have to set loose some vibrations that have an impact on the recipient of the curse, right? Like the radio, the sounds reach your speakers through the medium of radio waves. They don't just get there because somebody says they should. If you're just thinking that God says it and it happens, you're talking cartoons. The Quran says, "He saith unto a thing, be, and it is." But this presupposes that what is about to be created already exists to hear the divine command it must now obey. That paradox, I realize, is offered to us, not hidden from us readers. It is clever and happily displayed, but it still does not make any sense, and that's fatal. That's my point. It just doesn't make any sense, even any theological sense. A funny instance of this sort of cartoon supernaturalism is the gospel miracle of Jesus multiplying the loaves and the fish. As David Friedrich Strauss pointed out in his classic book, The Life of Jesus Critically Examined, the story loses any possible plausibility as soon as we take a close look at it. What the heck are we supposed to envision Jesus doing? Does he take hold of both ends of a fish or a barley roll and then stretch it out like a sponge till it breaks, each half somehow the same size as the original? It is a cartoon, not a possible case of someone using a technique amenable to rational understanding if we only knew more about it. By contrast, Think of the desperate arguments offered by defendants of the fake Turin Shroud. At least they have one point in their favor when they contend that the photo-negative image on the shroud was the result of some kind of radiation flash caused by the power of God resurrecting Jesus. They realized there would have to be some way God did it. Even if it was a miracle, right? These syndenologists are not trying to show what happened in lieu of a miracle, as Joe Nickell does when he demonstrates how some medieval painter could have faked the shroud image. No, they rightly understand that if God reached down and miraculously resurrected Jesus, he must have used some means. If there is a method, a way things happen, then even in the unseen realm of the gods, then you are envisioning nature, albeit a larger frame of reference. Epicurus himself esteemed something of a god by the movement he started, taught that the gods in heaven possess material substance. They occupy space, they have volume. Their bodies are made of stuff more rarefied than ours. If you look at it this way, at least you know what you're talking about when you say the word spirit. Remember, both the Hebrew ruach and the Greek pneuma, the biblical words translated spirit, mean wind or breath, implying a rarefied material character, like air. And if that's the case, we're again putting the gods on the side of nature. In the same vein, some people like to say that spirit is another word for energy. Fine, but then it becomes perfectly clear that spirit is natural, not supernatural. You're making it tantamount to electricity or nuclear power. So what's left on the other side? An abstraction that is timeless, located nowhere in particular, above acting, beyond linear thought, since he is perfect with nothing only potentially done and left to do, already knowing everything and not needing to pursue a sequence of thoughts. Pure abstraction. What's the difference between that and nothing? If the personal God of Scripture exists as more than a literary cipher, he is to be conceived as a being, not as being itself. If he does things, he employs means. That's just part of what it means to do things. He is not omniscient, though presumably he is wise. He does not know the future because it is not there to be known. Instead, it is just that he is so clever and so powerful that once he determines that something shall happen, he needn't worry that anyone will be able to gainsay him. Thus, he does not foreknow the future, he just builds it. Such a God is not much different from a space alien, is he? A superior being indeed, maybe even the supreme being, but that's like saying that Superman is the greatest of the superheroes, the top dog, the top god. But that wouldn't mean we ought to worship him as God. Even with Superman's amazing powers, even with his tireless compassion toward us lesser mortals, it would be idolatry to worship him because, as Francis Schaeffer used to say of the Greek gods, Superman is not big enough. And neither is Jehovah. The biblical deity is more like Jack Kirby's Galactus. And that was intentional. Kirby said he meant for the devourer of worlds to be his analog to God. Paul Tillich recognized that the God of the Bible was not adequate, so he formulated a more abstract God concept and wrote of the God above God. Tillich stood in a long tradition of philosophical theology stretching back to the Stoics, who redefined the embarrassingly anthropomorphic and anthropopathic Zeus of Homer and Hesiod as the all-permeating impersonal logos. And that is a jump from the concrete living God to pure abstraction. You have to decide whether you can make any sense of idealist metaphysics. Does it make sense to regard abstractions like truth or eternal forms as being real, or even more real than discrete objects? I cannot see how. What, am I pretending to know better than Plato? Of course not. Compared to him, I'm an orangutan. But if Aristotle could disagree with him, I guess I can too. To make this jump is indeed to jump outside of the natural. But is it to jump from the natural to the supernatural? No, because whether you are talking about Zeus or Jehovah, you're talking necessarily about a discrete entity who pulls the strings, who acts in our world, or is supposed to. Nothing, I'm suggesting, removes that being qualitatively from the same category we occupy, the natural. He would differ from us merely quantitatively, like Superman or Cthulhu or Eric von Daniken's Ancient Astronauts. This would be true even if this God were your creator. You might fear this kind of a God, but it would be obsequiousness to worship him, merely degrading, toadying. Forgive us, Lord, for this our dreadful toadying. I don't see any reason to believe in such a natural God. And as far as I can see, there's no other kind. To deny that a supernatural God exists is a different kind of denial. It is not the fact that is missing, but the sense of it. Part 2. We have the advantage of thinking after Emile Durkheim, who understood that religion is epiphenomenal to society, a mystification of society in order to reinforce the strictures and the system that are necessary for a livable order. The pragmatic rules are prior to the mythology that seeks to give them an extra supernatural warrant in order to scare those who are too stupid to see that everyone must hold up his end of the thing or too selfish to care. The fear of death is no doubt one of the main reasons for being religious, but another of the things we fear is social chaos. That is the entropy which soon threatens us with death. We want safety and security in this life and the imagined next. We want to ensure the social compact which put an end to the war of all against all. How? Religion/society threatened those who were too stupid or selfish with extra warrants. Okay, smart guy, it's not just that crime doesn't pay. It's also a question of God sending you to an unremitting hell after death. We may not be able to catch and convict you, but God will. But if we recognize all this, isn't the jig up? Doesn't it work only as long as we believe in the divine origin of morality and the divine enforcement of it? No, it doesn't. Thomas Aquinas explained how even if God created humanity and decreed its laws, the latter stem pragmatically from the former. Because God made humans social animals, as Aristotle saw. A stable social system defined by laws, for instance, against stealing, murder, rape, defrauding, breach of contract. Such a system is needful. These God did not arbitrarily decree, as if he'd ordered Thou shalt walk upon thy hands every other Monday from 2 to 4:30 p.m., but rather derived from the natural good of the creatures he had made. Even God dealt with morality inductively and even situationally, as Aquinas had learned from Aristotle. The things that are right will vary with the individual and his situation. We must pursue the golden mean. Should we dive into the freezing river to rescue little Nell? For Schwarzenegger, it would not even be challenging. We should blame him if he had not dived in. For some pencil neck like Barney Fife, it would be foolhardy and not praiseworthy. For the average man, it would be a genuine risk, requiring courage worth the effort since there is a real chance it might work. So the content of virtue varies with the individual. There is no one size fits all stipulation. Instead, all of prescribed moral behavior is to be based upon natural law, the rules of optimum functionality. How do things, namely society, work best? Where this principle goes astray is when one retains a false inference of Aristotle, namely that each bodily organ has but a single intended function, so that to use it otherwise is wrong. For instance, the reproductive system. The erectile tissue seems to have been retained by evolution because it encourages sexual activity, which adds to the species. If it weren't for the function of reproduction, no erectile tissue. True enough, but does that mean it is immoral and perverse to make non-reproductive use of erectile tissue? Aquinas said yes, it is wrong to misuse sex for simply having fun with the one you love, as wrong as it would be to use your bare hands for a hammer. I reject this, of course, because non-procreative sex does no harm. To think it does is an error, but it doesn't discredit the Aquinas-Aristotle approach in general. It's just a poor application of it. Thus, even for Aquinas, though the atheist, the secularist, may fail to see the ultimate divine origin of society and humanity, he can easily enough discern what is necessary for us to live peacefully together. There will be gray areas, but the theist admits he has many of those too, where neither reason nor revelation speaks clearly, as any Christian discussion of medical ethics will make abundantly clear. The atheist cannot deter people with supernatural threats, but then they seem not to deter many believers anyway. In Tillich's terms, the theist and the atheist may share generally or exactly the same laws and mores, but the former holds them theonomously, recognizing that the law of the Creator governing him is authentically the law of his own being. I think this is what Leibniz intended when he said that though we are in every respect determined, this means just the opposite of being forced against our will. Even our will itself is the product of forces over which we had no control. So we have our will and desires from a source outside ourselves, whether blind factors like DNA and environment or a personal designer. But it is genuinely our will, and we rejoice to embrace it. Schleiermacher and Tillich would say that theonomy is the state of recognizing that we ourselves are not the source of our own selves, of our will and inclination. The acknowledgement of, quote, absolute dependence, quote. On the other hand, autonomy would be simply the absence or neglect of that sense of dependence. I am the master of my fate. Well, on one level, yes. You've been dealt a particular hand of cards, and it is up to you to decide how to play them. Looking even more closely, we might find that our choices as to how to play them is already established by subtle traits pre-programmed into us. But at least we will be doing our duty to self, finding it satisfying, not an alien compulsion, as with someone under the gun. Dance, bang. We will not regard our inherited inclinations as a heteronymous command from an alien authority. The atheist can see the same moral system as the believer, but from the standpoint of autonomy, and that is good enough. Aquinas freely admitted that unaided reason could discern the requirements for the good life, and that Aristotle had. What the atheist has, he supposes, what the theist has, he supposes, that the atheist lacks, and it may not be much of a lack after all, is a Kantian categorical imperative, a transcendent obligation to keep the moral law, his duty to his divine creator. Is there a categorical imperative? No, but I want to keep the category, even though or especially because it's an empty one. That way we will remain aware of what our morality is not. We must remember the strictly hypothetical, prudential, conditional character of our duties and choices. I get this from Nietzsche, who said that there is no capital T truth, nothing in the truth category. But if we eliminate the truth category, we will be tempted to forget the difference and to assume our fictions are the truth. No, they are only fictions, and we mustn't forget that. If we do, the result will be just what you are bemoaning. Philosophers forgetting that they are merely framing hypotheses and coming to imagine they are absolute dogmas. For the atheist, a pragmatist, the obligation is but a hypothetical imperative. Assuming you want...